From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Supreme Court is under attack in a way it has not been for many years, if not decades, as Democrats and the press corps attack its ethical standards and even its legitimacy. This week, Senate Democrats hold a hearing that will target Justice Clarence Thomas in particular. In the meantime, Justice Samuel Alito sat down with our James Taranto and a contributor, David Rivkin, to talk about the court and the leak last year of his draft opinion in the Dobbs abortion case. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with aforementioned James Taranto, our editorial features editor, and of course, our regular Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both. James, first let's talk about your interview with Justice Alito, which took place last month. And of course, we published Friday, picked up everywhere, made a lot of news. Tell us what was on the justice's mind.
Well, the biggest news he made was a revelation that he thinks he knows who was behind the leak. Now, what happened was the Chief Justice assigned the Marshal of the Court, who is in charge of the Supreme Court police, to investigate. But the Marshal of the Court has limited investigative powers. And she questioned a lot of people and came up with, they put out a report in January, which was unclear as to how much they had narrowed down the suspects. Justice Alito thinks he knows who it is, and he is certain that he knows what the motive is, which is to change the opinion in Dobbs, the case that overturned Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey and did away with the constitutional right to abortion. And he notes that this leak made him and the other justices in the majority targets for assassination. And in fact, there was a man arrested and charged with attempted assassination of Brett Kavanaugh. We should note that he's pleaded not guilty.
So the scuttlebutt at the time from many was that this leak must have been from the right. This was somebody on the court who was trying to influence the court not to change the draft opinion in the case. You asked Alito about that. He found that dismaying.
Yes, the term he used was "that infuriates me." Justice Alito has a very reserved personality, so he didn't seem infuriated when he said that, but he used the word infuriated, and he said, look, we were targets of assassination. Would we do this to ourselves? It's totally implausible. And the justices and their spouses are now subject to extremely heightened security measures. He said they basically have to ride around in a tank. So why would they open themselves up to that sort of thing? Seemed convincing to me.
Kim, the reaction from the press corps, particularly the left-wing press corps, pardon the redundancy, is that this was outrageous of Alito to suggest that they were somehow at risk of assassination. Well, as James said, there was actually a man arrested outside Justice Kavanaugh's home last year after the leak came out, before the Dobbs opinion was released, saying upon his arrest that he intended to assassinate the justice. So it's not a fanciful invention here. It's something that really could happen.
Right. And one of the things that Alito made clear in this interview, which really hit home to me, was the point that, remember, when that draft decision was leaked, the assumption was that it had 5 justices in favor of it, and that the mentality, therefore, among some of the unhinged was that if you assassinated one judge, you would keep that opinion or that decision from going forward. And yes, we have the evidence of the young man who reportedly was attempting to assassinate Kavanaugh. I mean, the entire beginning of James's interview begins with the justice recounting how he was due around that time, not long after the leak had come out, to go speak at George Mason University. And on consultation with the Arlington police, they decided to do it by Zoom because he said it was extremely dangerous and not something that would be wise for the justice to do. So these are very real threats brought on by that leak.
James, why do you think our friends on the left were so upset by your interview, other than the fact that they were scooped?
Well, I think that accounts for a lot of it. But also, I think they don't like hearing the truth about this. I mean, they are trying to turn the Supreme Court into a political institution. The left tends to view all institutions, including the press, by the way, as political institutions. And because the Supreme Court and the Constitution are obstacles to the political and ideological fundamental interests of the Democratic Party. They're trying to discredit the court. And it's part of a campaign that also includes the recent smears against Justice Thomas and other justices.
Why do you think Justice Alito decided to talk? I mean, we had as you said, the official report from the marshal's office was indeterminate. By suggesting that he knows who it is, or thinks he knows, though he said that there's not enough evidence to release the name, he's certainly throwing a line out into the water, suggesting that maybe some other justices on the Supreme Court also have an idea who it is. Is he trying to, do you think, get more people to look at it? Is he trying to trigger a larger outside investigation? Why do you think he mentioned that?
Well, I don't want to speculate as to why he said what he said. I think what he said is interesting enough. We'd been planning this interview for some time, and I was surprised that he said this. And I immediately thought, there's our news.
Well, and of course, you were also talking to him about the law and other things. So that wasn't the only subject, but it was certainly newsworthy.
But I would say it's almost certain that the other justices know whatever Alito knows. Why would he know and not any of the others?
Right. And he did say that the leak did have an effect on the court. It was disruptive of their work. And I don't think he used this word, but the implication was that it sowed some distrust among the justices.
Yes, he did say there was distrust and they worked through it. He wasn't terribly specific, and I wouldn't expect him to be, because the Supreme Court is an institution that operates in confidentiality with this horrific breach.
And it's interesting that Alito, Kim, would speak out on this because in many ways the chief can't, or has a harder time doing it, as he represents the whole institution. But my own view is that it's good to hear a justice speak up, even though in doing so he took on the abuse of his critics and critics of the court, because as he pointed out in the interview, well, they're getting very few defenders. Our pages are one of them, the defenders, but there aren't too many others.
Yeah, can I suggest that that's the other reason that our friends in the media are outraged that he spoke out, is because it's not playing according to their rules. What they want to be able to do is attack the court, attack it again and again, write these smear articles, engage in character assassination. But if any of the justices speak up about that, then they want to present it as somehow unseemly that the court is engaging in any sort of political. Well, I mean, I guess they're just supposed to sit there and take it. We saw the same thing happen when Brett Kavanaugh, after he essentially been accused of being a rapist during his confirmation hearings, dared to stand up and not just defend himself, but suggest some of this was politically motivated. And they all piled on, because you're just supposed to let them go along heaping their abuse. And I thought the way Alito did this, yes, he was able to speak when the chief finds it harder to speak on these issues. But the tone and the tenor of this interview that he did with James was very becoming of a justice. He didn't hurl accusations. He kind of laid out some of the facts and pointed out the ramifications of these attacks, which are the safety of the court, but also its legitimacy. And that was one thing that I thought was sort of interesting, too. He pointed out that one thing that's different here in modern times is it's not that people are attacking the court's opinions. It's okay to not agree with the court's opinions, but rather they are attacking the court's legitimacy and engaging in character assassination against individual justices, which is a very dangerous place to go in this situation.
An important point about the character assassination. Judicial authority rests in large part on a certain mystique, right? Judges are impartial. They're hearing the cases before them without any interest in it. But judges are also human beings. So what this technique does is it attacks the justices as human beings. And then when they respond as human beings, as Brett Kavanaugh did, they said, oh, you're not acting like a judge. But there's no reason that a judge should act like a judge when he's attacked as a human being, when he's accused of some horrible personal wrongdoing.
All right, let's turn to the ethics campaign and listen to Dick Durbin, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, talk about what he is going to do this week at his hearing on Supreme Court ethics reform.
I felt that the responsible thing to do was to appeal to the Chief Justice to come before the committee. 92 justices of the Supreme Court have testified before congressional committees since 1960. It's not unprecedented. But he declined. I'm disappointed that he did, but he declined. We're going forward, and I think we're going to produce a bipartisan code of ethics. There are several on the table. Angus King and Lisa Murkowski have a proposal moving forward. Chris Murphy, I mentioned earlier, in guns, has a similar thing in ethics. ethics, but the leading proposal is from Sheldon Whitehouse, who chairs our court subcommittee. I think we can come up with a bipartisan measure and move forward and say to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land should not have the lowest standard of ethics in the federal government.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start with the decision, Kim, about
how many hours do we have, Paul?
about whether or not the chief was correct to decline to appear.
Of course he was. As the chief noted in his letter back to Durbin and the committee, it is exceedingly rare for the Chief Justice to appear in front of the committee. And to the extent that that has happened in the past, it's been on very mundane topics. And the whole nature of this, quote, request was obviously extremely different here. What Durbin was essentially doing is demanding a separate and equal branch of government appear and bow before his committee and be subjected to a grilling. And as Roberts noted in his letter, this raises some very consequential separation of powers issues. Notably, his letter back to Durbin explaining all of this also contained a statement that was signed by all 9 of the justices, pointing to all of the ethical obligations and different rules that they have adopted over the years in an effort to clarify for the committee exactly the situation of what governs the Supreme Court and where they stand and why in some cases things are different for them than for lower courts. Durbin has decided that that is not going to be acceptable and he's going to go ahead with this hearing anyway, because let's remember that whether the justice had showed up or not, the idea is to beat on the court and try to gin up public support or support within the Senate for some sort of Senate imposed or congressionally imposed rules on the court.